You wake before sunrise with a sharp pain running across your hand. Blood drips onto the dirt. The cut is deep, too deep. There is no hospital, no antibiotics, no painkillers, no emergency room, no doctor to reassure you that everything will be fine. For almost all of human history, this wasn't an emergency. It was simply another day. And yet, your ancestors survived. Not all of them, of course. Many never made it through childhood. Others died from infected wounds, difficult births, broken bones, or diseases that medicine now treats in days. Life was brutally uncertain. So how did enough people survive for more than 300,000 years to eventually become you? The answer isn't that ancient humans were invincible. The answer is far more surprising. Your first doctor was never another person. It was your own body. Long before medicine existed, evolution had already spent millions of years building one of the most sophisticated defense systems on Earth, your immune system. Every cut, every scrape, every bite triggered an invisible army. White blood cells rushed toward damaged tissue. Inflammation increased blood flow, bringing nutrients and immune cells to the injury. Scabs sealed wounds. New skin slowly formed underneath. It sounds, but imagine seeing it without understanding biology. A wound close. Fever rises to fight infection. Broken bones. Here's the th, your immune system WW. It was shaped through countless generations, where survivor every generation. A slight B, great over T. But even the strongest immune system has limits. So what happened when someone suffered a serious injury? Archaeology offers an extraordinary clue. Scientists have discovered skeletons from prehistoric sites showing completely healed broken legs, crushed arms, severe skull fractures, and even amputations. These weren't people who simply got lucky. Healing injuries like these required weeks, sometimes months, without food, without movement, without hunting, without protection. Someone had to help. One famous example comes from the Neanderthal remains found at Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq. 1. Individual survived despite severe injuries, including damage that likely left him partially blind and with limited use of one arm. He lived for years afterward. How? Not because he was exceptionally strong, because other people kept him alive. Food was shared, protection was shared, care was shared. For all the stereotypes about prehistoric life being nothing but violence, survival often depended on compassion. Would you survive alone with a broken leg? Neither could your ancestors. Their greatest medicine wasn't found in plants, it was found in each other. Now, fair question, if there were no doctors, did ancient humans know anything about treating wounds? Surprisingly, yes. Evidence from different cultures across prehistory and early history suggests that humans learned through observation. Clean water removed dirt. Fire sterilized wooden tools. Certain plants appeared to soothe pain or reduce swelling. Honey, used in many ancient societies, naturally slows the growth of many bacteria because of its chemistry and low water content. None of this replaced modern medicine. None of it guaranteed survival, but practical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. People remembered what seemed to help. They avoided what consistently failed. Knowledge became tradition. Tradition became survival. Think about that. No laboratories, no microscopes, no chemistry textbooks. Just generations paying attention. Your ancestors were scientists in the oldest possible way. They observed. They experimented, they remembered, then they taught the next generation. But perhaps the biggest advantage ancient humans had wasn't a treatment at all. It was the way they lived. Today, infectious diseases spread rapidly because millions of people live close together. Cities, apartment buildings, subways, airports, schools. One infected person can unknowingly expose hundreds of others in a single day. For most hunter-gatherers, life looked completely different. Groups were usually small, often only a few dozen people. If illness appeared, it had fewer opportunities to spread continuously through massive populations. Some diseases that thrive in dense settlements struggle to persist in scattered groups. That doesn't mean prehistoric life was safe, far from it. Parasites were common, injuries were constant, danger surrounded every hunt. But epidemic diseases became much more common after agriculture allowed humans to live together in large permanent settlements alongside domesticated animals. This changed everything. Around 12,000 years ago, villages grew, food became more reliable, populations exploded, animals lived beside humans, waste accumulated, new diseases evolved. Ironically, one of humanity's greatest achievements also created entirely new medical problems. Would you trade fewer epidemics for a life filled with predators, starvation, and constant physical danger? Probably not. Every era has its own price. Another surprise hides inside prehistoric diets. Hunter-gatherers rarely depended on one food alone. Depending on where they lived, they ate wild fruits, roots, nuts, seeds, fish, shellfish, insects, eggs, mushrooms, and game animals. Their meals changed with the seasons. This diversity often provided a wide range of vitamins and minerals that supported immune function. Of course, food shortages also happened. Some seasons brought abundance, others brought hunger. There was no guarantee, no supermarket, no backup plan, just whatever nature provided. And that uncertainty shaped the human body itself. Your metabolism evolved expecting periods of feast and famine. Your brain evolved to seek calorie-rich food whenever it appeared. That instinct still exists today. Except now food rarely disappears. The same survival system that once saved your ancestors can now quietly harm your health. Here's another misconception. People often imagine prehistoric humans as extraordinarily healthy athletes. Reality was much harsher. Life expectancy at birth was low, largely because many children died young. Women faced enormous risks during childbirth. Simple infections could become fatal. Broken teeth caused terrible suffering. Accidents during hunting could end a life within hours. This wasn't paradise, it was survival. Every sunrise was earned. Yet those who survived childhood often lived much longer than many people assume. Some reached their 60s or even beyond. Older adults became living libraries. They remembered migration routes, edible plants, dangerous animals, seasonal weather, water sources. Their knowledge was often more valuable than physical strength. Imagine losing the oldest person in your group. You weren't just losing a family member, you were losing decades of accumulated survival knowledge. Perhaps that's why respect for elders appears so deeply rooted across many traditional societies. Knowledge kept everyone alive, but the real weapon wasn't strength, it wasn't speed, it wasn't sharper spears, it was cooperation. Humans became remarkably successful because individuals rarely faced problems alone. One hunted, another gathered, someone watched the children, someone cared for the injured, someone remembered medicinal plants, someone made tools. Each person became part of a larger survival system. Modern medicine sometimes makes healing seem like something provided by professionals inside buildings. For most of human history, healing happened inside communities, around fires, inside shelters, surrounded by family, supported by people who refused to leave someone behind. That instinct hasn't disappeared. Even today, patients with strong social support often recover better from illness than those facing recovery alone. Your body heals, your community helps. Both matter. Now think about fear. Imagine cutting your hand today. Your first instinct might be panic. Search online, call someone, drive to urgent care. Ancient humans certainly feared injury too, but they also accepted something modern society often struggles to accept. Pain was part of life. Uncertainty was part of life. Nature offered no guarantees. Instead of trying to eliminate every risk, they became experts at managing it. Watch carefully before crossing a river, carry fire, stay close to trusted companions, learn every edible plant, avoid unnecessary danger. Preparation was their insurance policy. Knowledge was their prescription. Experience was their survival guide. Doesn't that sound strangely familiar? Modern society often promises complete safety, complete certainty, complete control, yet anxiety continues to rise. Your ancestors possessed almost none of those guarantees. Still, they woke each morning and continued. Perhaps resilience isn't built by removing every hardship. Perhaps it's built by learning that hardship can be survived. That doesn't mean modern medicine isn't extraordinary. It absolutely is. Vaccines, antibiotics, emergency surgery, anesthesia. These advances have saved hundreds of millions of lives. A simple infection that once killed healthy young adults can now often be treated within days. Broken bones heal more reliably. Childbirth is far safer. Life expectancy has increased dramatically. No prehistoric tribe would choose to give those advances away. But modern medicine can sometimes create an illusion that health comes entirely from outside ourselves, that healing always arrives in a bottle, a prescription, or a hospital bed. Your ancestors remind you of something deeper. Before any doctor could help, your own body was already trying to save you. Before any medicine existed, cooperation increased the odds of survival. Before science explained immunity, evolution had already written millions of years of biological knowledge into every cell you possess. Your heartbeat, your fever, your scars, they are ancient technologies, older than civilization, older than farming, older than history itself. The next time you notice a scar somewhere on your body, remember what it represents. Not perfection, recovery, evidence that your body fought, repaired, adapted, and continued. That quiet process links you directly to countless generations stretching back into prehistory. You wake before sunrise with a deep cut across your hand. Today, help may be only minutes away. For that, you should be grateful. But perhaps the greatest lesson from your ancestors isn't that they survived without doctors. It's that they survived because they relied on something modern life often forgets: resilient bodies, resilient communities, and resilient minds. In a world of appointments, notifications, deadlines, and endless screens, it's easy to believe that every solution must come from somewhere outside yourself. Yet for almost all of human history, the strongest medicine wasn't convenience, constant comfort, or perfect certainty. It was connection, adaptation, and the quiet confidence that tomorrow was worth fighting for. Perhaps the greatest irony of modern life is this: you have access to more medical knowledge than any generation before you, yet many people feel more disconnected from their own bodies than ever before. Your ancestors lived with danger every day, but they also lived closer to the rhythms that shaped the human species. And somewhere beneath the noise of modern civilization, that ancient biology is still waiting to be remembered.